All right, here we are,
We're live.
Psychedelics Today. We are here live streaming in this webinar with Susan Hess Logeais, filmmaker. You recently put together The Way of the Psychonaut, kind of a documentary on Stan Grof, intersecting with your own personal kind of experience with that kind of material. So
Mhm.
welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So um, it's kind of a dumb question, but you encounter Stan and all of a sudden you want to do stuff. Like that's what most of us want to do. You're like, and so like what in particular was kind of your impetus to share the work of Grof in film?
Well, so I'm 61, and in my early 30s, I discovered shamanic journey work with Michael Harner, and I learned about quantum physics at some point, and I was having some really incredible experiences, and um, it, then I had kids, and I say this in the movie a little bit. I lost contact with this dimension of spirits that had been guiding me to that point. And so when I met Stan, actually I was looking for LSD. I know this sounds really weird, but as a mother of teenagers, I didn't want to get arrested and spend time in jail for looking for LSD. So I decided that I would try breath work. And that's when I discovered Stan. And then I learned that Stan had this 14 years at Esalen, and essentially he introduced everything that I had been doing. Breath work, rebirthing, all these various techniques that are out there. And then I sat for 2 days listening to him lecture, and then did 2 breathwork experiences during the course of a workshop. And it was, first of all, remarkable. And what really struck me was his breadth of knowledge and his knowledge of mythology, the Tibetan art of the science of Tantra. He understood the psychology, he understood quantum physics. He just knew so much that I figured if I told his story, I'd complete my curiosity in those subjects. And I could share what I had been wanting to share with the world, finally, through him.
Yeah, that's excellent. It is super impressive, and it's kind of a lost art, becoming this kind of, I don't want to say polymath, because that it implies that you know something about everything or a lot about everything, which isn't really possible anymore. But it's kind of like Joseph Campbell kind of intersection with psychoanalysis and psychedelics and all that, and tantra. It's unbelievable, the breadth of knowledge that he was carrying at that era.
Well, that is the thing overall is, and even recently, Stan had a stroke a few months after we finished filming. And my parents are older. My dad passed as I was beginning this project. And I talk about that in the movie, how finally my biggest, high dose session, which wasn't anything like the sessions I'd had in my early 20s, because I never did high dose. I never laid down. I never covered my eyes. I was at Studio 54 having a fabulous time.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, different story. But experiencing the death of my father in that way allowed me to help him die. And so as I was working with Stan, I had this feeling of urgency. Every time I showed up to meet him and to work with him, I always had a camera. We were always recording, because I never knew if he would live long enough for me to finish the project. And of course, he reconnected with his dear love, Brigitte. They're married. Her energy in his life. He was sort of reborn after the passing of his deceased wife, Christina. And so again, we finished filming. It was 2018 May, and then in August, in the course of a preparation for a back surgery, he had a mild stroke. And so he's recovered very, very well, but the words aren't there to the degree that he would like them to be. And even still, in our conversations, I mentioned my interest in creating a regenerative community and bartering instead of money. And he goes, there's a book, The Power of Money. It's called Community Currency. And he just pulled it out. The imagery I use, it's like his brain is a file cabinet, and he'll take a moment, and it's like he reaches back in and pulls this thing out, and then here it is. And it's exactly what you needed to hear.
It's amazing, his memory and just breadth of knowledge. whenever I see him talk, I'm just like, how does he remember all this stuff? I saw him at what was it, Psychedelic Science 2013, and I believe that was the year he had like 101, 102-degree fever, and he's just up there talking. I'm like, if I was that sick, I would not be up on stage. And probably wouldn't be able to remember everything or even know what the hell I was saying.
Well,
Hmm.
and you're both breathwork facilitators. And if you've ever heard Stan lecture, I remember everybody was asleep and he was still going because he just had, once he got into the stream of something, he would just keep going.
That's funny. It sounds familiar. um, so I worked with him once, or he came over and did some body work on my breather at one point at this like insight and opening retreat with Jack Cornfield. And I I was just shocked at how rapid fire he was in terms of associations with like unconscious material, like a lion to a color. And I just watched this guy like open up and, you know, crying little baby to like ecstatic dancing person within, I don't know, 20 minutes. It was unbelievable. I have always been impressed, just, you know, the way he was working and speaking, and left a mark for sure.
Well, Rick Tarnas said something when we first began this project. We interviewed Jack Cornfield and Rick Tarnas, and they both
Mm.
told me their favorite Stan stories, and those end up in the movie as illustrations of his courage. And it's just what Rick told me was he has this classical education, that he had this incredibly broad exposure to so many subjects, and he had a mastery of them. And then it just an insatiable curiosity. He's always curious. And we went out to film walking along the beach, Stinson Beach, and some of this footage is in the movie as well. And I couldn't get him to look up from all the little creatures that were on the sand. It was like, Stan, Stan, come on.
Mm. A little bit like Socrates too. Interesting. So yeah, there was some line in the film like he's just interested in everything. He's never found something like a reason to be bored almost. And yeah, I really appreciate that attitude. And it's such a legacy that he's left behind too. Like he's still around and started a new training program even. So
Yeah.
it's just pretty cool. So in terms of the film, how long was the process for you?
5 years,
Mm.
basically. I mean, partly because Stan would be living part-time in Germany, or they'd be traveling around the world offering speaking at trainings and leading them. And it just took that long. We had to do reenactments, we had to raise the money for it. But the one thing that I'm so proud of is that throughout this process, Stan watched every version of the film. And every single time, if something wasn't accurate about the way I was representing his story,
Mm.
he would let me know and we would change it. So what I feel good about is that this is an accurate representation of his journey, of his theory, and its application.
Mm. Yeah,
How
there's some.
many other films get that opportunity?
Yeah.
Go ahead,
I
Kyle.
was gonna say there are some pieces in there that I guess I haven't heard, like his
There's a few,
younger
yeah.
years of him being arrested. Like whenever I hear about him getting into medical school, it's always like, oh, I was going to be an animator, and then I came across Freud's interpretation of dreams, but I never heard the that story of being arrested, and I thought that was really, really fascinating.
Well, and that's the other thing too. As I was telling Stan's story, he grew up under the Nazis in occupation of then Czechoslovakia, and I didn't know about Reinhard Heydrich, and he was the number 3 in the Nazi Party. And they dropped from England. They dropped in Czech resistance fighters who attacked him, and he died from his wounds later. But Hitler turned around. He was going to kill 10,000 innocent Czech citizens. He destroyed 2 villages. Stan grew up under that. And he was telling me how, well, first of all, I showed him what I had put together, and he was going, you kind of skipped over the Nazis. And I went, oh, and he goes, have you ever heard of Reinhard Heydrich? And I'm going, no, but I started to look it up, and then I was blown away, because I can't imagine the impact on a young man. I mean, he was 8 years old at the time, And he said that it felt like every 5 minutes a siren would go off. That was the assassination of another innocent Czech citizen, because they were trying to force the public to give up the location of those resistance fighters.
Oh, brutal.
Yeah.
So
And
impressive times. Like this is not something we can, as Americans, really relate to. I'm sure other folks in other countries can, but this is really a crazy situation. And he did fairly resilient. He proved to be fairly resilient.
well, yeah, and even his brother Paul was saying, getting into medical school, there was a group of about 15 young men who were arrested, and Stan was the only one that got out. He was the only one that was found to have insufficient information against them. And Paul, his brother Paul, was saying that they felt that there was like something was there protecting his path, making sure that he would find that way. Because Paul has also, we have an interview with Paul that shows up later in our series, and he came at it from the biological perspective, but now, after studying mood disorders, consciousness is the ground of all being. Integration is the difference between mental illness or a functioning human being.
I lost my train of thought. There's just so much impressive stuff that happened there in the movie. And like Kyle said, I've been talking about Stan since 2001. I've been talking to other people about Stan since 2003, and it's just incredible how many stories there are that weren't totally captured in his books and in other places. And one thing that I loved was when LSD started coming onto the screen in these glass ampules, and they actually had to saw them open. I was shocked, but it makes a lot of sense that that's how drugs were shipped back then. Wild. Did you get any interesting stories that maybe weren't captured about LSD that Stan might be willing to share?
Well, I mean, I think when they were at Spring Grove, I mean, the main thing when you think about it, he had stories about Albert Hoffman, who kept a supply and had microdosing every third day up until the age of 102. He was having 25 micrograms every other day or so. I think it was maybe every third day until the age of 102. And up until the day he died, he was translucent. He was such a clear being. And, Stan, the story that he tells around Spring Grove with the Flora character who seemed to be possessed by the devil, what she was speaking, what she was threatening them with was their sort of off-book exploration of the substance and the possibility that she could destroy their careers and shut down the program. And, that patient wouldn't have known that. So, I mean, there's some other stories that I probably shouldn't tell, but, even Michael Murphy was saying that the years that they were at Esalen, there was some work going on. And they were sure that the DEA knew about it, but they never bothered them. They never tried to shut them down or arrest them or anything. And so I found that interesting. They just sort of allowed it to happen.
Right. Like there's always a subtext in the Esalen discussions that there was definitely psychedelics happening there. It's never discussed publicly. And I'm sure those days are behind them. They're a very different organization now. So, yeah, it's always fascinating. And all the people that were there, like you had a really great list of everybody that was there. But even that, like very comprehensive list, like there was even people that like, we don't, John Lilly, for instance, and like there's so many names of people that were there. It's just shocking how beautiful that time was. Have you been to Esalen?
I have been there, and it's a lovely setting. And the interesting thing was, I remember it had to be in the 1980s, and I was modeling at the time and in New York, and Esalen seemed so far away that I dreamt of going there. I wanted so badly to be part of what was happening. and it just felt like I couldn't do it. It was too far away. If I left, I wouldn't get any more jobs. My income would be I just seemed like I couldn't get there.
Right.
And when I described to Rick Tarnas all the various experiences I had, he said, you had your own mini Esalen, and that was these techniques that were seeping out into the general public and finding their way. One thing I should say is I remember in our early work, I was asking Stan, he was telling me about the receptors in the brain, that the mistake that people were making was that if you took LSD every day, the receptors in the brain are filled. You have to wait 2 weeks in between a dose to have the full experience of the session. And the other thing he said was you can't commit suicide on LSD because the brain can only absorb 600 micrograms and it shuts off.
That's interesting. I could see something like that.
Did you say commit suicide? Is that what
Well,
you said?
meaning that if people think if they can do an overdose,
okay.
Right, I could
right.
take a handful of Quaaludes in my, that'd be the end of me, or
Right.
whatever. You can't take enough LSD to kill yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have a psychotic break and cause yourself trouble, but in terms of its physical impact on your body, after 600 micrograms, you'd have a rough ride, but your body would be fine.
Yeah. That's a good safety profile.
Yeah. It's that and mushrooms, somewhat similar.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's wild things that can happen on LSD. Like, it's okay if you don't want to talk about it, but in the film, you kind of discuss it a little bit. Like, you were doing some of your own journey work. Did you eventually, after you got comfortable with the kind of Michael Harner style shamanic work, like do some inner exploration with LSD on your own, or?
Well, I had to, because I try to recreate the essence of a psychedelic journey in the course of the movie. And
Right.
I felt like I only knew what a low dose was like. I didn't know what a high dose was like. And so I had, I don't know, 4 or 5 psychedelic experiences, LSD experiences. And then I also did some work with ayahuasca and also with mushrooms, and have also had experiences with 5-MeO-DMT. So I wanted to have a full scope of what these things meant, and it's very profound. It takes you to a very deep place, the higher doses, that we look at the things that we're not willing to face otherwise. And it wasn't, and then if you throw in the astrology, you must be aware of archetypal astrology that Rick Tarnas and Stan developed.
I've got his book over here.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful piece of work.
Yeah, so when you look at, and in fact, I would decide when based on transits.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then there was a period where it was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction opposite my sun or whatever, and it was an endless ritual dismemberment. That was not fun.
Sounds like
was it helpful?
Transit.
It was incredibly helpful, and I had a sitter for every single one of those experiences, and I am a firm believer in a sitter because sometimes it's frightening. And if you have a human being there who can just hold your hand or rub your back or just to anchor you, so that your psyche is having this deep experience, but you physically are here.
Yeah. Did you get to chat with Stan or Rick about the astrology aspect? It's really interesting. Like, we've had some folks in that lineage about astrology on our podcast, and definitely gotten a little bit of pushback here and there from some people. But the people that we had on were mostly from that lineage, coming from the archetypal psychology, astrology world, and kind of have that depth-oriented position. And I think it's just really interesting to look at these archetypal themes, and can be really helpful for understanding, or at least having some sort of framework for an experience for some of those archetypal themes come up. So yeah, were you able to chat to Stan about?
Oh yeah. Definitely. Before I even worked with Stan on this project, I purchased, is it Cosmos and Psyche or Psyche and Cosmos? I always get those words wrong. I've got the book over there
Cosmos and
somewhere.
Psyche.
There you go, Cosmos and Psyche. And essentially it describes 3,000 years of our history from the perspective of what transits were taking place. And so you're able to understand when you look at history, how there are waves of things that happen. And how, and if you look at it through that lens, it starts to make perfect sense. These are forces that have, they call them multivalent. They have many possible ways of being expressed. And where we're at in our own lives with when we were born and what was in the transits at that time, that's how it plays out in our individual lives. And, you know, again, the experience I experienced my father's death before he died in this first high dose LSD session. And then for the last 2 months of his life, I was able to be there in a place of non-attachment. So I felt he was living into another dimension of a life he might have had. And from the Tibetan perspective, it's your attachments and desires that pull you back in the process of death. And so I felt that he was able to clear things that might have hooked him after his passing. And so when I looked back at the archetypal things that were happening then, and then Rick Tarnas's daughter, Becca Tarnas, is very skilled in this. And so I've had Rick give me a perspective, Matthew Stelzner give me a perspective, and then Becca also. And what it paints, it just sort of shows you how these influences were presenting the possibility for a deep, profound experience. And integration is the key. The more we understand what's going on, the better chance we have of taking these experiences and making them as transformational as possible.
Yeah. Could you expand on your understanding of integration?
Well, integration is an interesting thing, you know, because we're physical beings, but I'm a huge fan of also quantum physics. And I do a Vajrayana technique called Chu, which is basically offering your body up to the goddesses and then, you know, ritual sacrifice and then coming back into form. So I have a sense of awareness of the world as being more than just my physical body. I feel that there are spiritual energies that we can interact with at all times. And so for me, integration is not just the emotional aspect of something, and it's not just the mental or intellectual understanding or even the physical embodiment, but how can that experience allow me to strengthen my connection and capacity to connect with these spiritual dimensions that I feel are wanting to work through us and guide us through the challenges that we face.
That's cool. It's like there's so many, it comes back to the term holotropic, right? Moving towards wholeness. And there's so many parts of us that how can we kind of unify them, like through what practices and whatever else do we need to, you know, bring this together. So yeah, I like that. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, and I'm thankful too, you know, and in the course of making this, you know, first of all, I got my bachelor's in my 50s because I just went to work as a young person. And now I'm going back for my master's at CIIS. And so we're reading all this information, and I've come across a book recently called Blackfoot Physics by F. David Peat. And he was a colleague of David Bohm's. And David Bohm was somebody who created the implicate, not created, but proposed the implicate order, the understanding of what isn't physical, which is most of everything, and then what we perceive as the manifest. And just this idea that, you know, we're having this experience, but we're part of a bigger picture. We have access to this other dimension and dimensions, and they're not, it's unitive consciousness, but with differentiated spiritual elements with which we can interact and be guided. So it's complex and it's rich and it's fun to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the big draws is there's such a large collection of work that people interested in transpersonal psychology and holotropic states should really eventually expose themselves to. There's so much. It's really wild. And that's one of the things that really fascinated me at the beginning. It's like all these books that nobody in my university or home life ever really knew anything about or cared to discuss. Like I'm sure they at least had, Be Here Now, Ram Dass's classic, but
Right.
I but everything else I don't really think they were aware. And
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that David Pete talks about in Blackfoot Physics, and I see somebody, could you repeat the name of the book on astrology? Yeah, Cosmos and Psyche. Thank you, Joe, for putting it there. But anyway, in Blackfoot Physics, he talks about the European language, which, was sort of, it influences even Slavic languages down to Sanskrit. It's very much focused on nouns, on objects. And it's permeated the whole global construct. And so we're looking at the world as things that are different than ourselves, when in fact, the indigenous perspective or First Peoples perspective is it's about process and movement and verbs. And so there aren't objects, there are relationships, there are exchanges there. So it's a more felt experience of the world and a less intellectual experience of the world. And that, I believe, Rick Tarnas speaks about, we're heading for a collective death rebirth experience. Mm-hmm. And so my feeling is this is what needs to die, is this object-oriented perception of reality.
That's funny. I was just talking about this today with my stepsister about language and how language really helps us like perceive our reality. And I was just saying, like, one of these teachers that I really like, Martin Prachtel, he always said in the Mayan village that he grew up in or spent time in, they don't have a verb to be. And if you think about that, like, how do you have, like that really shapes how you go to your day to day if there's no verb to be, right? I mean, really interesting to think about.
Yeah, and he was even saying how like Mayan language, we were visiting Guatemala and someone was speaking one of the dialects, and it's so much sound as opposed to, I can't hear a word, but it's more of a sound because it's trying to participate in the reality that they're perceiving.
Yeah. It's fascinating.
Oh, it is. I know.
We're having a chat with our teacher the other day about kind of Westerners trying to get really deep into indigenous traditions and how, each of our cultures has so much inertia and we've inherited so much from that inertia. It's just like quite difficult to bridge that gap. So one of the main reasons I'm so thankful for Stan and his work is that it kind of is a Western framework and way of understanding all of this stuff that, maybe it's not equal to that work in the indigenous populations, but it's at least something that's for us. And I think really helpful for the, modern West.
Well, it's a bridge. It's it's because you have to you have to step across something to start to experience another way of being. And, I'm thinking, you mentioned about integration earlier, wanted me to discuss that or talk about it a little bit more. And I was remembering Paul Groff had said something about integration, as did Stan, as did Fritjof Capra. And so, these are all in these interviews that we're streaming every Thursday, starting tomorrow over the course of the summer. But essentially that all of these spiritual beings are always there. And someone who is schizophrenic is aware of all of it all the time. And someone who is operating, in the normal world has had that field of perception reduced so that it's a narrower understanding of what's out there. And what Paul Groff found was that their mental illness is in families. They would have 1,000 people within a family tree in the work that they're doing up in Canada. And they would look back at family histories and realize mental illness or mood disorders had been in these families for centuries. but nobody was ever considered to be mentally ill because they were just allowed to be who they were. And so the cultural context has so much to do with what's considered normal. And that so much of what our Western understanding of psychotic break would be spiritual emergence or some other possibility of expression or connection with these other possibilities.
Can you share what was shared with you by those Indigenous folks about your experience? So, like, if you were, go ahead. It seems like you got it.
I think I know what you're referring to. Yeah. With my near-death experience and meeting my teacher. Yeah.
Oh wow.
So yeah, I had it for Susan, for those on that haven't been following us. I had a near-death experience when I was 16, and just really changed everything completely for me. Waking up and just seeing everything in a totally new way, and I had a really hard time integrating that experience and coming back to the day to day, because it was like Kyle died, and I was just felt like somebody completely different, and I struggled with it. I didn't really know how to work with it. The thing that like really tripped me out was like, where is this information coming from? I felt like something told me all this stuff. And, then I came across psychedelics, and that really led me down a path to study transpersonal psychology. When I enrolled in this bachelor's program, I was taking, I think it was an eco-psychology course. And the teacher that I met there is part Lakota and Cherokee, and he was talking about shamanism during this eco-psych course. And I just had to tell him my story, and told him, I had a really hard time integrating my experience. I felt really lost. And he just looked at me and said, yeah, it's a shame. He was like, if you lived in a traditional culture, the elders would have stepped in to teach you this new way of being and this new way of seeing. They would have provided you the tools to know how to navigate this. He's like, but unfortunately, you live in a culture without rights and elders that know how to really navigate this stuff, and you had to really find it on your own. And I just always wonder, what would it be like if we did view these states of consciousness in a different way, and we did have elders that would step in and say, hey, this is possibly normal. I know spiritual emergence is like a spectrum, and I've worked in this field for a bit, and I understand the potential risks of romanticizing it, but also the risks of pathologizing something that could be potentially life-changing. I always said I was really thankful that I think I kept my mouth shut when I would talk to some doctors and whatnot about what I was actually experiencing after my near-death experience, so it didn't turn into pathology. But yeah, that just always stuck out of like, wow, there's other ways of being, and there's other communities and people out there that can really embrace this without saying you're crazy, right? And then, of course, I mean, Stan saved my life in that sense of coming across Stan's work when I was 18 or 19 and being like, oh my God, like this guy is just speaking my language. I mean, he falling upon his book was like the event that brought me here to do a lot of this work. Really.
Same.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to, add that Maria Mangini, who the interview that we're sharing tomorrow, she was very involved in psychedelics and sort of a psychedelic historian in terms of her knowledge and her understanding of it. And she speaks a lot about the need of rites of passage, or the need for rites of passage, that those are such critical things in allowing an individual to, and Stan would say, as we point this out in the movie, Joseph Campbell, when he discovered Stan's 4 perinatal matrices, said, oh, this is the monomyth that was the enigma for me. Why does every culture have this same myth? And it's because they're reliving their birth process. It's through the reliving of their birth process that they're able to become adults and face those fears that they were too small to understand. And also that the birth process, like a near-death experience, the veil between this dimension and other dimensions is very, very thin. And so suddenly here are all these archetypal images and forces coming into your field of awareness. And, you know, a newborn can't handle that. A young person has just been exposed to things that who knows how much that triggered in your own birth memories. But without the container to help you make sense of what you just experienced.
Yeah, I yeah, exactly. I definitely fell down I believe, yeah, having some sort of rites of passage back into, I don't know, I mean, it would need to be culturally appropriate, but I think that's something that's really missing in our culture and would really help people kind of, you know, step into new phases in their life. I mean, it's very interesting that we don't really have any structural passage, like rites of passages in our culture, besides maybe going to college, drinking, stuff like that.
Yeah,
You know,
getting a driver's license,
yeah.
losing your virginity, you know,
Yeah.
whatever those things are. But they're kind of without, they lack the idea of becoming part of a community, of taking on responsibility. And that's really what those rites of passage were about.
Yep.
So just a quick reminder to everybody watching that you can put in or ask questions in the Q&A at the bottom center. We'll get to those in a little bit. And if you're on Facebook watching, just pop them in the comment thread there on the live stream, and we'll try to get to them all.
Yeah.
So Susan, was there any particular moment in the making of the film that was really surprising for you? I'm sure you had a number of them, but anything really stand out for you?
Well, I think, you know, I look back now and I think overall, it was sort of like all these ideas and experiences had been floating around for a while, because, you know, I'm in my 60s or early 60s, and it was meeting Stan and making the movie that allowed me to kind of put it in context, to give it form. It's like the process of telling his story allowed me to give form to a lifetime of experiences and lifetimes of experience, just sort of begin to understand what is the world, and what am I doing in it. That was sort of what I got out of it.
That's great.
You know, I think about Stan's theories, and I think about the coex, the perinatal birth theories, holotropic breath work, and just all of his work with LSD. And I'm wondering, like, through this project, I guess, like, what are some of, like, the big kind of legacy things for Stan that really, you know, you think about and that really stood out during this film? I know that's kind of a big question, but.
Wow. Well, I just kind of going back to the idea that, you know, I went to Rajneeshpuram, I did rebirthing, I did bioenergetics, I learned about quantum physics, the shamanic journey work. Stan has had a remarkable impact on generations that sort of flowed out of his time at Esalen, that his incredible curiosity and willingness to bring in so many different perspectives and approaches to accessing spiritual or non-ordinary states of consciousness or holotropic states of consciousness. It was such a sort of a wave of opening that just washed over this country and Europe and everywhere else that they went. Russia, he's huge in Russia. He's got a huge following in China, not so much about the psychedelics, because that's a no-go, but just the theories and the openness. Even Rudolf Steiner's big in China. And so I just see that he sort of gave birth to a new form of consciousness taking hold, or not gave birth, but was the midwife for this way of being in the world, allowed it to come in its incredible complexity and richness.
So you are a victim of this COVID virus because you're putting the film out now. I'm sure you would have had a theater release and had a few people there. How did you pivot? You've got obviously a great team behind you now. Like,
I teamed up with Mitch Schultz, who's the director of DMT Spirit Molecule, and his social media guru, Matt Humble. Mike Margulies was my introduction to them and my introduction to you. and also to the Stephen Tucker, whose live stream studio is what will be streaming our project. But what I realized overall, I actually think the Earth is protecting herself by, not attacking, but making humanity, bringing us down to our knees, basically, globally, simultaneously, so that we are forced to rethink how we're living on this planet. I think she's offering us a chance to change before the real shit hits the fan. And so that's my personal understanding. And so my thought was, well, okay, let me take that message and let's do it this way. Let's make it available to as many people as possible. Nobody has to go to a theater. Nobody has to get in a car. Nobody has to get in a plane. And we can just make it available online. Let's just do that. And so Mitch and Matt were ready to go, and Mike introduced us to Stephen, and here we are.
That's perfect. And how are you doing the releases? So let's talk about this launch. You've got a number of live streams coming up, and what are those live streams?
Well, so over the course of the documentary, I even, brought up the sheet here. We've interviewed Maria Mancini, Sean Kelly, Ralph Metzner, and Stan had a conversation, Rick Tarnas, George Sarlo, who is an amazing man who tells his personal story, a man in his 80s who grew up under the Nazis in Hungary, and ended up through experience with ayahuasca, healing the wounds of that horrible time of his life. We have Robin Carhart Harris, Paul Groff, Bill Melton, the Verifone founder, who has funded some of the programs at CIIS, he and his wife, Mei Hong Su. And Fritjof Capra is one of the people that we're speaking to. We have Becca Tarnas on archetypal astrology, Yvonne Smith, who shows how Jungian analysts deal with this sort of information, Brigitte Groff, and then Stan also goes in depth on ideas of the archetypes and what is psyche, etc. Rupert Sheldrake, his wife Jill Peirce, and then Michael Murphy about the years at Esalen, Rick Doblin giving us a history of what happened with why psychedelics were shut down, and a bit of his own story and what sort of promise they hold. Michael Harner had a conversation with Stan. Susan Mokelke, who is the president of the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, goes more in depth on the shamanic journey work, and then a conversation between Irvin Laszlo, Amit Goswami, and Stan. So these were interviews that I did over the course of 5 years. And Michael Harner is no longer with us in physical form. Ralph left his physical form a while ago as well. And so it just felt like the information that each of these individuals shared was so valuable that they deserved to be seen in their entirety. So it seemed that by streaming them as a lead up, and then Mitch has called these sneak peeks. So before we launch the sale of the film in the fall, we are giving people a chance to stream it so they can just see what the movie is. And then Stan and Brigitte will participate after these streaming sneak peeks to be available for Q&A, just answer what they can.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. Very excited about it. And it's a really reasonable price. How much are you charging for the film when it comes out?
Well, the sneak peek is, by the time it goes through Eventbrite, it brought it up to about $9 something, but under $10. And then the interviews of the experts are all free. And
Awesome.
That's, every Thursday, 12 o'clock Pacific time, and then of course, as it makes its way across the country. And this first month, you can find the information on the Facebook page, The Way of the Psychonaut. DMT Spirit Molecule is sort of co-hosting us. And then the website is thewayofthepsychonaut.com watch. That's where all of the things are, but the interviews will stream off of both Facebook pages, whether it's DMT or The Way of the Psychonaut.
Yeah, Psychonaut.
Cool. So anything more before we jump into questions? All right. So strap in. So first one here. If someone would like to study Shod, the practice you talked about earlier, Could you recommend a book or someone to check out?
Well, I'm working with somebody named Lama Wangdu, and he was hosted by the Movement Center here in Portland, Oregon, but that ashram recently closed. But they're still teaching it. If you go to, I think, the website, the Movement Center, and you look up their course offerings, they may still offer it. We're doing it remotely because we can't even physically be in the same room together. But it's a beautiful practice, especially since there's been so much death recently. And I mean, let's face it, we're all going to die. So we might as well get comfortable letting go of the physical and being, open to our experiencing ourselves as spirit.
Great, thank you. Next one here. This is the sneak peek at the end of the month.
Yeah, it'll be probably the last Sunday of every month.
Okay. Oh, cool. That's a nice way to do it. I like that.
Yeah.
Next question here. Does Stan recognize the ontology of spiritual encounters during holotropic experiences? Are they real or merely psychological, or is he agnostic on the question? I have my own point of view on what Stan might think. Like, it doesn't matter, like you had the experience and a human had that experience. So in that sense, it is real. But how that extends to others is a tricky thing. And I don't know, maybe let's have you stab at it, Susan.
Well, actually, this is my big point, in the conversation with Michael Harner, in the conversation with Ralph Metzner, and Stan will be on after both of those to talk a little bit, again, as best he can. And I'm sure he'll do beautifully with Brigitta's help. Anyway, both Michael and Ralph struggled to admit that these spiritual dimensions and the beings you encounter are ontologically real. They are real. And Ralph hesitated because admitting them in academic circles would be the death knell for their publishing. They would no longer be considered relevant.
So in meaning that an entity like a, let's say to be PC, Zeus, has some sort of ontological reality and is an independent entity of some sort.
I
But
think he would.
What is that really saying, though, is the problem for me. It says this much, and monkeys with sharp teeth with acid trying to figure this out is like, we're stabbing in the dark in a lot of ways. Though they're onto something. There is some sort of ontological reality there. Ontological status is the term I like.
Yes.
But beyond that, like, what are we talking about? It's a hard thing to answer.
It is. One example, Jorge Ferrer, who writes about, what's it called? Darn it anyway. Participation in the Mystery is I just was reading all these books because I have to write a paper. But Jorge Ferrer is talking about his month of every other day ayahuasca experiences with some sort of a shaman. I don't know where this happened, but I believe, it was a Shibopu, if I'm saying that wrong. Shipibo, there you go, thank you. Anyway, he one night opened his eyes and he saw a stream coming out of the mouth of the shaman, and it led, it drifted across the room, and these beings came into the room, and they were made out of this ether that had come out of his mouth, and they began moving around the room, working with the individuals who were in process. And they worked with him at some point, and he said it was a profound transformation. So he does believe Jorge would speak to the reality of these things. And he spoke about a San Pedro experience with other individuals and seeing a sort of a red web, and turning to other people that were participating with him and saying, do you see something there? And they'd go, yeah, it's a red web. And 3 people saw the same thing, which allowed him to feel confident in it being something tangible and not out of his imagination.
Right. And there are ways to do controlled studies to figure this stuff out, under acceptable conditions. It's just, outside the realm of what ethicists might be willing to endorse. But it's totally something we could check out. And Jorge Ferrer, definitely check him out. He was on New Thinking Aloud. not that long ago. Really great YouTube show. And he's got a lot of great stuff to say.
Yeah,
Um,
I enjoyed reading his book.
I can't wait to actually read his work. It's probably going to be very interesting. So questions here. This is a bit of a trivia question from Facebook. Did Stan ever meet Terence McKenna? This has come up like 3 or 4 times. That's an affirmative?
I mean, you know,
I lean towards yes, but I have not heard
you
one
know,
way or the other.
personally, Stan has pictures of Terence McKenna with his wife and child. These are out of his personal library of images. I didn't incorporate any images of Terence McKenna into the movie because we never really talked about Terence McKenna, but I believe while Stan was at Esalen during that period, Terence McKenna, Rupert Sheldrake, and was it Ram Dass? I can't remember. There was a third person, and they had a number of conversations, and that was during Stan's tenure. So I'm pretty sure that they interacted.
Oh man, what was that guy's name? He was the mathematician. So it was always Sheldrake, McKenna, and
Carl Pribron?
Ralph Abraham, the mathematician.
Okay.
They were famous for trialogues.
Yes.
And then Stan was probably there around the same time. That's cool. And good to know. Will it be on Netflix?
Gee, I don't
Not
know.
soon.
You know, kind of part of the thing too is that I very much, you know, want to, Netflix would be great eventually, but I want to make sure that it's accessible to people over a long period of time. And I'm not quite sure how Netflix works, but if it's not a license, you know, when some entity licenses something, they are generally the sole holder of that product and control its availability to people. And so I am reluctant to, you know, they haven't knocked on my door yet, but at some point, if they do, I would be very cautious to make sure that I can still make it available to as many people as possible.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Next one here. It's kind of long. If you interviewed Carhart Harris, do you believe modern medicine is close to helping people in a real way? I have been suffering and I just worsen. I know no one, well, that's maybe not what I want to read here, but I think yes, like psychedelic medicine is here and has been treating people in a very real way and will continue to do so.
Well, I can explain what Robin tells us and what I've heard other people say during various conferences is that, so the brain has a hierarchical structure, meaning that there are parts of the brain that dominate access to information of the other parts of your brain. And so we can get into loops, and that can be anorexia, addiction, depression, compulsive behaviors. And so when you take a psychedelic, what happens is the entire brain lights up and information is available to all parts of the brain simultaneously. So that sort of structured hierarchical, you know, whatever protocol is gone. And then of course, once the psychedelic wears off, your brain kind of goes back to that structured functioning. However, you had access to that information. And so there's the possibility of breaking free of those loops.
Yeah, thank you. So next, from Shayna, thank you, Shayna. We have a lot of work to do. Yeah, absolutely agree. Stan's research on 3 domains of the psyche offers us a template for understanding wisdom through a Western lens, yet many traditional cultures are much more advanced in that they have learned how to open the psyche to ever more subtle, expansive, intelligent, blissful, and subtle states. Sorry, I'm trying to fight back a sneeze. And protect those states with culturally specific beings that serve as gatekeepers, deities, etc. We know we are lacking rites of passage with elders, cultural cohesion. Now to the question, I'm curious in what direction you see our transformational culture heading and how your film aids in that process. First comment before you answer, it's very interesting timing with your release. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think I've said it over the course of our webinar here is that Rick Tarnas speaks to this death rebirth that humanity is facing. And if you study history, you see that cultures and evolution in general, the universe, it gets through ever more complexity, and then, and then here comes another version, and the dinosaurs are gone, and now here come the mammals, and now here's humanity, and boy, have we made a mess of things. And so I feel that this transition that's being asked of us is to become less material and more energetic, more etheric, in the, like lighter, less dense, more aware of the spiritual dimensions, and to participate with them. Another thing that David Pete talks about in Blackfoot Physics are the compacts that the Olmec and the Maya had with these spirit dimensions, and how they honored them through ceremonies and rituals, and that corn was developed out of grasses through this compact, this request for what we need to survive and thrive. And so I do believe that this is an opportunity. We can't go back. We're not going to be, go back into this sort of archaic humanity that was totally merged with the natural world, but we can take where we've come, to this knowledge that we've gained, and combine that with this awareness and interaction and participation with the spiritual dimension. I do believe that's where we're going.
Great. So Patricia here is curious about your experience so far at CIIS with the master's program you're in. Are you in the PCC program?
I am.
Oh, that's beautiful. Philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. We know a number of graduates. Some of the people on your film, Becca, I guess, is a graduate of that program. What do you think of it so far? Would you recommend it to people?
Well, I think it's great. I'm Miss Experiential, and I'm often the oldest student in my course, and so I think I drive everybody nuts by wanting to not go into the intellectual, theoretical, but go more toward the experiential. However, I have been exposed to ideas and forced to make sense of what I think in ways that I haven't had to previously. I am very thankful. Sean Kelly is a remarkable teacher. Rick Tarnas is so knowledgeable. Brian Swim is amazing. Robert McDermott has such a knowledge of spiritual literature and perspectives. They curate this information for you. And they also, Elizabeth Allison, with her understanding of integral ecologies and indigenous beliefs, traditional, what's the word, tech? I forget, traditional. Anyway, there's that E word in there, but it has to do with this knowledge of the indigenous populations and how we could use their way of looking at the world and be better for it.
That's great. It seems like there's a question out there. I don't think the three of us are going to be able to answer it. Do you think psychedelics can repair damage caused by SSRIs? Or is there someone that might know? He already reached out to Ben Malcolm, spirit pharmacist, and he doesn't have an answer. Anybody?
Well, I'll say this. I mean, I do know after, again, interviewing Robin Carhart Harris, because one of the first screenings of the movie was somebody who's very involved in electric shock therapy, or ECT, I think they call it. And she did not appreciate the way Stan described his experience. In the movie I talk about, Stan's introduction to psychiatry was giving, 25 electroshock therapies a day and 15 insulin comas, I mean, and people would break bones and thrash around. And so what Robin said was that when you take first of all, SSRs suppress your capacity to experience things. And one of the psychiatrists that he mentions in his interview describes losing a year of his life on SSRs. And these are serotonin receptor suppression medicines. And so he felt like he was half alive, and he needed 2 years to get 1 year of actual experience in life. And so what I know about neurophysiology is that blood flow strengthens neural pathways. And so if you've been in a protocol of suppressing brain activity, et cetera, then if you begin to I'm not suggesting be on LSD all the time, you know, or psilocybin or whatever, but they do provide people with the possibility of expanding your whatever neural pathways, so that you kind of come back to a more fuller experience of life. I'm sure it takes time. Movement also grows the brain. Music grows the brain remarkably. Interacting with people grows the brain. So it's just, if you want to get back what you've lost, you need a rich interaction with life and a creative expression. But it is definitely possible.
I like how you threw in those other alternatives. I always think about like Dr. Dan Siegel's work. I think it was Mindsight maybe, or I forget which book it was, but really talks about like neuroplasticity. And I think the one quote that always stood out for me was just focused attention. Sometimes that's all the brain needs. It's focused attention on something like meditation to, you know, have that neuroplasticity and neurogrowth. So.
And movement is huge. You know, it doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to be ballet or tango, you know, it can be ecstatic dance or Tai Chi and yoga, but getting into the body, really feeling the body, because those neural pathways go out to the beyond the edge of your body, and you can develop that awareness, then you'll bring it back on.
So you mentioned ECT. There's some amazing footage you had in the film. People should definitely watch it, you know, just for that. ECT was certainly very primitive back then. It's become a lot more sophisticated. Like, I don't think we should throw it out, but I think we should, you know, perhaps be a little more skeptical before prescribing that course of treatment. But yeah, people do have very strong convulsions. The TV series Homeland has a couple ECT scenes. I'm sure you could just find it on YouTube too, Peter.
Well, and Robin said, you know, that psychedelics, if you want to think of them as sort of turning the brain off and back on, like a computer. If you want to use the computer analogy, you're like, nothing's working. Turn it off, turn it back on. Whatever it was hanging on to drops away, and often things function better. Well, that's ECT, because when it's off, you're gone. You're not participating. When you're back, you're back. Okay, you're better off, hopefully. When it's through psychedelics doing that reset of the brain, you're participating. You are aware and awake. And I believe, and Robin also states this, it gives the person a chance to observe what might have been in the way. It's like looking into your computer and go, oh, all this malware, you know, and in us, it's like, what emotion am I hanging on to? What memory has screwed me up? Or some people would even say, what entity has attached itself to me that I don't need to have sucking my energy out?
Yeah, there's a lot there. And, you know, SSRIs are wildly helpful for some people. They perform, you know, a really interesting thing on the brain and the brain chemistry. A lot of people really hate it. A lot of people love it. It certainly has saved lives, but it certainly also has cost lives. You know, coming off of it, you have to be very careful and should work very closely with a shrink or like a very good therapist or something, but it's definitely not something you should do on your own. And then repairing from that, I don't exactly know what kind of damage happens, to be honest, with folks out there. Perhaps receptor sites get a little burned out from too much exposure to serotonin, but I don't have that science to really be able to speak to that one. And I'm not seeing too many more questions here, so maybe we can just point people again to where we can find your website and the film and your release cycle with these live streams.
Right. Well, so starting tomorrow, 12 o'clock Pacific time, will be the streaming of Maria Vittoria Mangini's interview, followed by a Q&A with her. And her focus is remarkable. This historical understanding of psychedelics, the need for rites of passage, became a midwife, and now she's assisting people die. You know, she wants them to die well, and to remove fear and help people through these things. So that's tomorrow. And what will happen then is every Thursday, 12 o'clock Pacific time, we'll be streaming from the Facebook page, the website, and the DMT. I'm not sure the DMT spirit molecule will happen every week, but those will be available. And then they will remain available during the course of the week on the Facebook page. But the website, thewayofthepsychonaut.com watch page, is where all of these interviews are available. And so you'll be able to watch them. And then at the end of every month, and once a month, we'll have a Sunday screening. I think at least it's in June, and I think it will happen in June and this May also. It will be Stan who will be commenting on his conversation with Ralph Metzner. That's on May 17th. And then at the end of the month, the last Sunday of every month is the sneak peek of the movie.
That's outstanding.
Awesome. I think I just dropped that link in there, wayofthepsychonaut.com/watch. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Thank you,
Awesome.
Kyle.
All right. Well, I think that's good. Everybody out there watching, thank you for coming. And this will be available for replay on Facebook and YouTube. So check it out there. And Susan Hess Logeais, thank you very much for your work and commitment to share the legacy of Stan and being so vulnerable yourself in the film. It was amazing that you were willing to put yourself out there like that. So thank you for that. It takes courage.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Joe. And you too, Kyle. It was really a pleasure talking with you both. I'm so impressed that you're both facilitators in the holotropic breath work and support Stan, because he certainly deserves to be honored for his contribution.
Well, thank you. Just so we don't get in trouble. Transpersonal breath work, but we're in the lineage of Stan.
Well, it's okay.
Oh, it's for the lawyers out there.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Thank you all. And
right.
thank you, Susan.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Bye-bye.
you.